I'm really happy to have you
Th-
here. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Ida. It's absolutely my pleasure. Thank you so much for having me, and thank you so much for the warm welcome at the beginning of this session. As Ida said, my background is in information retrieval, and I even have a quick slide to talk about what information retrieval is. Um, I honestly came to work on some of these more social or thinking about the societal impact of technology, partly from two reasons. I think uh, centrally was it was kind of like self motivation as a person, a concerned person in tech, and also I coincidentally 6 years ago moved to Montreal where I was co-located with the Fate lab here, and also had a lot of influences from people in the lab here, and which kind of got me started on this. So today, the talk that I'm gonna be giving is particularly focused on some thinking that I've been doing in the information retrieval context and its implications and responsibility towards society. This is a different kind of a talk than I have typically given, kind of technical. This is kind of informed by a few pieces a couple of pieces, or a few pieces that I wrote over the last year and a half. So I just wanted to kind of add a disclaimer because I know I'm in a room full of people with all of the relevant backgrounds that really needs to inform this kind of work, but that's not really my core area. So I really want to hope this is a way of really making those connections. And please feel free to correct me if I get something wrong in here, or have if there are some important connections I'm missing. That's the kind of conversation I would love to have after the talk. Having said that, let me just quickly jump in because I do want to get through a few things over the next 30-40 minutes. So information retrieval, let me just start with the kind of the very definition of it. So information retrieval, in case any of you are not familiar with, is a field in computing that specifically focuses on both the study and design of tools and methods for satisfying people's information need by retrieving relevant information. So kind of the most popular kind of systems or platforms that you might think of that we work on are web search engines or recommender system. Interestingly, IR as a field in computing has actually has roots in library science and linguistics, and and today it is very well. I was maybe not very well, but it is definitely connected with and is informed by some of the fields adjacent to IR, including HCI, information sciences, natural language processing, and obviously machine learning in recent days. So, what is going on in IR today, right? So, we are seeing this really kind of different perspective, opposing perspective in the field today, where and a lot of it is coming on the back of these emerging technologies such as generative AI, where on one side you have this really people are excited about how these new technologies might help us realize completely new information access modalities, reimagine what the search or the recommender stack looks like, and we even seeing some really interesting evidence that, for example, one of the core problems we think about in IR is just estimating relevance of information artifacts like documents or passages to a user's express need in form, let's say, of a search query. And we are actually at a point where we are pretty confidently starting to see that these kind of large language models and other generative models are actually able to estimate relevance better than crowd workers who may not obviously have expertise in the domain, but still that was kind of the what used to be the ground truth that the field used to try to aspire to making their machine learning model towards, and now we are in a state where these models are even outperforming the crowd workers in relevance estimate. And on the other side, at the same time, you're having all of these very serious and very justified conversations about how these new technologies might be disrupting information ecosystem. They might be acting as misinformation super spreaders. They might be at the same time concentrating power and reproducing historical marginalization. And all of this at with the additional heavy price tag of accelerating anthropogenic climate change. And so, as an IR researcher, one of the kind of kind of inner conflict that I'm kind of faced with when I'm thinking about okay, what should my research focus on? It's so one side I have generative AI might really change what IR even means. There is a huge push both in in industry, in government, in even in academia to kind of focus on these kind of the changing IR based on what AI makes plausible, right? And obviously, the work in this space comes with a lot of associated excitement, prestige, rewards, and so on. And then on the other side, I kind of look out from the window and you can suddenly see that our world is facing several mutually reinforcing crises, like talk about the COVID pandemic, the oncoming onslaught of climate change, rise in fascism in global politics, increasing global conflicts, and even growing global inequities in general. And each of these kind of challenges our world is facing directly intersects with the concerns of social justice and emancipation. And I strongly personally believe that there is an important role of information in this particular context. So, at the heart of this, one of the ways I kind of try to contextualize this is to think about who are we really building these systems for, information access systems. And so, in IR, one of the really nice things that I love about it is that IR has always placed a very strong emphasis on understanding the needs of the user and whether or not we are actually addressing real user needs. And this is something I really found very valuable in IR compared to some of the other more maybe machine learning or NLP communities where it felt a bit more disconnected from the real needs of the people. Then obviously in kind of practical settings, we care about the needs of the system or the platform owners, which might correspond with revenue, market share, brand, and whatnot, and also with the needs of the content producers and publishers, which again might correspond to things like traffic that we send to them or content monetization and so on and so forth. But what seems to be getting much less attention in this conversation is the needs of the society as a whole, and whether or not, how should we even think about optimizing our information access platforms towards some desirable social outcomes? And these desirable social outcomes could be informed citizenry, could be reliable health information, or even social justice. And when the conversation does include things around the needs of society, they're typically framed through very narrow lens that is demanding for, let's say, more fairness or less misinformation. And so this is a point where I would also want to kind of take a few seconds to kind of reflect on the broader conversation we are having about fairness and bias in IR, in AI, in computer science in general, right? So as a person who's been working on fairness and other kind of aspects of in the AI and IR context, I personally really feel we almost feels like most days we are stuck in this kind of infinite loop where in a never-ending loop where you're continuously new technologies are coming out and everybody's busy trying to enumerate all the possible problems or harms that could happen. And before you even finished enumerating, forget about addressing, there is something new on that has come out and you're kind of chasing that cycle. The other thing I reflect on a lot is, and again, a lot of people, especially in the fact community and others, have been voicing this, is that it also starting to feel like we are talking about algorithmic fairness and bias very often when some of these questions are actually about how these systems shift power and how these systems and their implication intersects with question about justice, right? And maybe algorithmic fairness and bias are not the right frame to think about this. I would even go as far as to say, even the framing of responsible AI or responsible IR, I question if they themselves kind of presuppose that these technologies themselves can be made responsible and that it is the technology, not the power concentration by those building and wielding these systems and platforms that should be the focus of what we should be challenging. So all of this to say is I want to now bring it down to the one motivating question that I have been kind of noodling in my head over the last couple of years. And sorry, this question is very wordy and I should have probably tried to make it more succinct, but I wanted to capture all the aspects of it. So the question that is really motivating some of my thinking over the last year and particularly this talk is what framing of IR research can motivate the field to reach out beyond its disciplinary boundaries and to work with scholars, experts, and community advocates, scholars, experts from other fields, and community advocates to address exactly the critical societal needs of our time in a way that is both informed by our historical struggles for justice and emancipation, as well as situated in the ongoing social movement building. And so this is in this context, after almost a year of thinking, what I'm starting to slowly gravitate towards is the specific framing of emancipatory information retrieval. So what is emancipatory information retrieval? So I define emancipatory IR as the study and development of information access methods that challenge all forms of human oppression and situates its activities within broader collective emancipatory praxis. So emancipatory here, as you might guess, is like, it signifies the moral concern of universal humanization of all people and the elimination of oppression so that everybody can collectively flourish. And one of the things that really attracts me to this particular framing is that when you think about what emancipatory IR represents, it's really these two basic concepts, right, of universally humanizing everybody. Again, so, we briefly talked about the Paulo Freire's pedagogy of the oppressed, and that's another really core thing that Freire talks about is our main goal is this big goal of our society in the current age is of humanizing everyone. And the second part of it is the elimination of any kind of oppression. And what's attractive to me in this case is that it feels like a little nugget at the right granularity where we can express this value and hope that a large portion of the population, both within academic, scholarly circles, but also outside, can actually agree that to be kind of a goal we can aspire towards. Obviously, this is obviously not going to be 100%. Not everybody believes that this should be the goal. Otherwise, we wouldn't have any problems in the world. But on the other hand, I also think the notion of emancipation then directly captures to the real kind of dimensions of oppression, that historical and ongoing oppression, things like colonialism, racism, patriarchy, casteism, transphobia, ableism, and so on and so forth. So I just both kind of boils it down to something very specific, but at the same time connects with some of the real dimensions that where the struggle is ongoing. And last but not the least, I kind of intentionally included this last part in the definition because I wanted to kind of from the very beginning wanted to emphasize that we do not want this kind of work to be kind of a non-performative academic gaze where it's not about writing papers. It is really about the real change, and in that context, we really need to consider how this kind of research is embedded within broader movement building and how broader movement building is necessary fundamentally for doing this kind of research. So I wanted to kind of emphasize that. Now, the next question we might ask is why is emancipation even a relevant concept for IR specifically, right? And this is where one of the things that motivates me is this realization that access to information is very critical to our collective sense making of our place in the world and our relationship with others and with the world itself, right? And it is because of that reason that throughout history we have seen authoritarian forces have tried to control, and not just history, even today we've seen very clear example where we've seen authoritarian forces trying to take control of how information access platforms to control what is disseminated and how it is disseminated. And it is that reason that historically, through all different struggles, information access, different media platforms have been the site of conflict between liberation and oppression. The other reason I think this is very relevant to IR is, and this is where I'm getting a little bit ahead of topics I'll touch upon a little later in the talk, is that if you think about what kind of things emancipatory IR would try to do, all of those points to some important research questions that I think is very relevant to IR, right? So we might think about what kind of new ways we want to imagine people experience information. This leads you to for example, in ways that uplifts marginalized voices and promotes emancipatory pedagogy. And this, I think, has definitely very important research questions at the intersection of IR, HCI, design, and multiple other fields, right? Similarly, if you think about how do we make these systems robust from platform captured by authoritarian forces, again, you might think about things like decentralization and so on, where again, you have very fundamental research question that spans from system design to how you think about ranking and all of those kind of core questions in IR, but in a federated setting. And of course, last but not the least, a lot of the work we are doing directly has today human and ecological costs, like for example, environmental cost or impact on in terms of data labor, and all of those things. Again, I think they're both technical and social questions about how we build these technologies without having those harmful side effects. And what I really want to challenge in doing all of kind of trying to center this concept of emancipation in IR is to really challenge the field to move beyond a restrictive view of IR, which is focusing on algorithmic advances as measurable through shared benchmarks and leaderboards, to a more expansive view of IR, which situates information access as a mechanism or a vehicle for social good. So how do we then get started? Hopefully, I've set up some motivation for why we should think about this framing of emancipatory IR. But what does it even mean, and how do we actually frame the work we need to do here? So here I have developed a very recently in one of my papers, I'm kind of developing a framework that I call it the framework of practices, projects, and provocations for emancipatory IR. And so to just I'll talk through this in details, but just to kind of visually present this, what you see here is like, I can imagine there will be lots of different projects trying to address different aspects or different aspirations in the context of emancipatory IR, and those are represented as these hexagons at the center. And I intentionally leave some hexagons empty to kind of indicate that, like, obviously this is not a complete list, and this is something that it's actually the community that we pull together for this work needs to kind of co-develop among themselves. I'm mostly kind of like including these as examples or exemplars for the kind of work we might want to do. And then surrounding these projects, we have what I'm calling as the practices of emancipatory IR, which I'm actually borrowing largely from a paper from Emancipatory Social Science, which lists where we talk about the three practices, which is diagnose and critique, imagine viable alternatives, and elaborate theories of change. And I'll talk about that in more details in the next slide. And the last but not the least, the component of this emancipatory IR framework is the provocations, where I'm thinking about the role of prefigurative politics and different kind of epistemologies like feminist thought, abolitionist thought, and so on, as well as kind of reflective practices that can help us really kind of shake up from our status quo dominating kind of imaginaries and really pushes us to creatively think about alternatives. So what I'm going to do in the next few minutes, and I know I'm kind of rushing through a bunch of different material here, but hopefully I'm not going too fast here. But what I'm going to do next is talk a little bit about how I'm thinking about these different practices and maybe situate some of the work that I have done recently in along this axis. Of course, I've not done work on all of these, and even the ones I've done are pretty kind of early stage. So talking about the practices, as I mentioned, we have the three practices. The first is obviously diagnose and critique. We are talking about really trying to understand the structural problem that we have today, both in terms of the technology, but also how we are building the technology and who's building the technology, issues even in our social arrangements in terms of our communities and relationships between institutions and so on, that leads to shaping the technology the way it is. Following that, you have the second practice, which is the imagining viable alternatives, both for our socio-technical futures and how we get there and how we build technologies and so on and so forth. And last but not the least, once we can imagine these different alternatives, we then think about, okay, what is the actual projects we need to, or the problems we need to work on to take us there, and also drawing hopefully kind of a line between the work we are doing and how we think the changes can be achieved. So starting with the diagnose and critique, I want to quickly talk about some work that I've recently done. So last year I had the opportunity to co-author this chapter on the socio-technical implications of generative AI for information access. And one of the key things we really wanted to focus on is to emphasize that, we always talk about a few things like, fairness and bias, think about hallucination. But really what we should be doing is to think about much more broadly about how these, when we think about generative AI in information access, how are these systems potentially disrupting how content is produced, consumed, monetized, and manipulated towards specific end, and how different actors and stakeholders who operate and relate with each other in this ecosystem, how are we really shaping and reshaping those relationships? How are these systems shifting and concentrating power while also marginalizing those at the periphery? How is this research and these developments impacting academic research and innovation itself, as well as the ecological cost of our current AI technology trends? And what really I want to pop out here, and obviously I'm not going to have time to go through this in details, is I talked about the couple of things that the community talks a lot about, which is fairness and bias and hallucination. And it turns out those happens to be these two things in this large list of things, and obviously this list itself is not complete, right? By the way, I'm going to intentionally don't use the word hallucination. Instead, we phrased it as a game of telephone, in the sense that you have an LLM between the actual search results and the user, and so it's kind of doing a noisy translation. And there's actually One reason, obviously, is we don't use that phrase is because hallucination has an anthropomorphic, morphizing kind of a notion to it. But also, I don't think hallucination really gets to the heart of the problem, right? It's not just about that the LLM can reproduce incorrect information. It's that by inserting the LLM between the user and the information, you have actually shifted the responsibility of interpreting and validating and all of that responsibility from the user that they would have done by looking at the context in which the information is to the LLM. And I think that's a much bigger point than just reproducing incorrect information, right? Like you can have 10 people read a article and come away with very different takeaways from it. So there is that interpretation and other things that we are also kind of taking away, shifting the responsibilities, and that should also be the focus. So that's why we talk of it as a kind of a game of telephone or noisy translation rather than just hallucination. But to my bigger point, the bias amplification and this game of telephone is just two of these many different things that we could be talking about. So I want to quickly talk about what are the kind of mechanisms that leads to these broad kind of systemic consequences that we care about in this context. By the way, this consequences mechanism risk is also a framework that we developed as part of a separate work that we presented at FAC last year, but I'm not going to go into details of that. But just to give you some examples, when we're talking about information ecosystem disruption, we want to think about, for example, how LLMs are lowering the cost of generating low quality content, and can directly, increase content pollution on the web. We might also want to think about the game of telephone effect that I already mentioned. And then we might also want to think about how it's changing the economic incentives in this ecosystem in terms of not sending, for example, traffic to sites like Wikipedia or Stack Overflow, and effectively really disturbing the economic kind of incentive that existed in this ecosystem where search engines benefited from these sources of information, and these sources of information previously benefited from getting traffic from these information access platforms. And so that's a paradox of reuse, another problem that I think a lot of people are very concerned about. Similarly, when we talk about marginalization, again, we might want to think about bias amplification, obviously, but we also want to talk about the marginalization that comes from appropriation of data labor, right? So from uncompensated writers, programmers, and peer production communities, as well as the undercompensated crowd workers doing the labeling and other kind of work that's very critical for developing these systems. And what's really worrying for me is that if you look at this AI data labor dynamics, they really reflect kind of the historical global north, global south disparities, the historical racial capitalism and coloniality, right? It's like the benefits of AI is largely kind of concentrated for the global north, whereas all the data labor is concentrated to the global south. And then another kind of systemic issue that you might want to think about is how these systems might be concentrating power. And here, obviously, again, one of the most obvious things you might think about is how the control over the systems and platforms themselves are concentrated in the hands of few institutions because of compute and data moat. But also some of the things that makes me worried is the future potential applications like generative AI for ads, right? Imagine these platforms that hold so much personal information about individuals now with the ability to generate ads or whatever content that is explicitly personalized for the kind of languages that are going to be something that could be persuasive for individuals. And having these kind of systems for advertising or content generation, again, the control being concentrated in the hands of few institutions or few people in the world. So this is, again, there is some concern around AI persuasion that is now starting to show up in different, within the research community here. And I think that's actually one to kind of really keep an eye out on. And talking about kind of concentration of power, I think this is where I also want to just make sure I kind of emphasize that it's not just the technology, but even the narratives. And within the narratives, both the hype as well as the fear mongering that really almost unquestionably bolsters, the claims of foundational advancements. And there is some fundamentally kind of questions about the concentration of power here that people have been speaking out about. So, for example, the Research Institute AI Now, they had a report that came out, I think this was 2023, if I remember correctly, where they talked about the concentration of economic and political power in the hands of the tech industry as the core challenge posed by AI. Similarly, 2024 edition of the World Economic Forum, by the way, and this one really, when I first found out, it was kind of a bit jarring to read this. They list the World Economic Forum's Global Risk Report lists technological power concentration as the 12th top global risk for the coming decade, and it was the biggest upward mover in their annual ranking of global risk compared to the previous year. So some things that I think everybody should really, really be kind of like reflecting on what this really means for us as a society, and for our future. Um, and then on that notion of the ecological cost, again, I'm not going to go through all of these, but again, if you look at these statistics, they're pretty unnerving, right? If you look at in US, data centers consume more than 4% of total national electricity in 2022, and the number is projected to go to 6% by 2026. Some estimate that 2040, information and communication technologies (ICT) industry alone would account for 14% of global emission. And there was this Washington Post, this one, a news article that actually talked about how the projection for electricity demand for the next 9 years almost doubled in 2023. And of course, all of these statistics comes with a lot of nuance that we need to definitely consider. But I think it is important to kind of reflect of what all of these different statistics together, what picture it is painting, and how worried we should be in this context. So that's about the diagnosis and critique. Some of the work that I've been doing there. Next, to move on in talking about kind of imagining alternative futures, the main thing I've been kind of focusing on in this context is to even just raise the awareness that, all of the work that we are doing in our field is shaped by some very key kind of views, ideologies, values, and our views of our all the different imaginaries and visions for our socio-technical futures that almost always remain implicit, but play a very critical role in shaping how we think about technology and how we design the technologies for society. And honestly, just even bringing up that question, the first time I did this in an IR conference, I felt like the whole audience, it felt like everybody just ran into a brick wall. It just even posing that question felt like it was something that people weren't even thinking about, right? And so in this kind of work, the kind of questions, then follow-up questions that I'm really trying to kind of push the community to think about explicitly is like, whose socio-technical imaginaries are granted normative status, and what kind of radically alternative futures are we actually overlooking? What is the effect of increasing dominance of established for-profit platforms over research, and how does it influence and homogenize the kind of systems we are building? And what would fundamentally information access systems look like if designed for futures informed by feminist, queer, decolonial, anti-racist, anti-casteist, anti-ableist, abolitionist, and other thoughts and epistemologies? In this context, one of my favorite quotes is from the amazing author Ursula K. Le Guin. The exercise of imagination is dangerous to those who profit from the way things are because it has the power to show that the way things are is not permanent, not universal, not necessary. I think if I can get enough people to really internalize this, I think I would already call that a success. So how do we do that, right? And this is the part where I haven't done work yet, but one of the things that I would love to do, and this is where I am really kind of hoping that by doing these talks or having these conversation, I can find some of the right collaborators to kind of come together and do this work, because I don't even have all the necessary skills to pull this off. But one of the things I would love to do is to organize certain workshops where the goal is to bring in people from different disciplines and spend time really both on kind of thinking through the critiques and different provocations, but actually spend time on some design futuring of thinking about the alternative ways, radically alternative ways that people can experience information, radical alternative ways we can design these systems bottom up, and so on and so forth. And that then hopefully leads us towards thinking about the specific projects. How do we make that research sustainable? Where does the funding come from? And all of those questions. And of course, once you do that work, then hopefully that leads us to kind of then thinking about specific projects and the theories of change. But obviously, this I haven't done any work on this, because even the alternative futures really needs to be developed together as a community. I don't want to rush to ahead and be like, okay, this is Bhaskar's vision of the future. I think that's a completely foolish exercise. So what I have been trying to do is to kind of create this framework and then give people examples to just at least show that there is some concrete research to be done here, and then then try to focus on building the community. So with that note, I'll move on to kind of like, in the bigger framework of like, practices, projects, and provocations. I'll spend a few minutes on the projects and provocations. So on the projects, some of the projects that I think that the emancipatory IR should focus on, and I'm definitely not going to talk through in details about this, but things that I think concerns we should care about is how do we safeguard our platforms, access platforms, from easy platform capture by authoritarian forces, right? So this might push us to think about how to make these platforms decentralized, but also think about how to then have shared governance over these platforms. We need to think about safeguarding against surveillance, which means that we do not want to record everything like that people are doing, but also in that context thinking about how to build IR system without the availability of large scale click data and other kinds of user data that we typically train on, and that's kind of like the core secret sauce of most of these systems. We want to think about how to prevent public manipulation, and this leads to both questions about misinformation but also connects with the topic of AI persuasion that I mentioned before. We of course want to think about like questions about equity, bias, fairness, representational harms. That I think is another big area to focus on. But and that's something that obviously the community has been thinking a bit about at least for a while. We definitely want to also think about, and this is one that is close to my heart, which I don't think we've done enough, is think about how these information access platforms, these search result pages can be sites of promoting emancipatory pedagogy. And I'll give a very quick example in the next slide of this one. Last but not the least, like the couple of other things is like, thinking about the ecological and human costs, including data labor, and how do we build these technologies responsibly? Where does the materials for like, even the resources for these data centers and everything comes from? We know that they have direct implications for global certain conflicts in different parts of the geopolitical world with in terms of the resources that we need for the tech industry. So again, important questions there. And last but not the least, a big part of this work, I think, is about looking at this from community building and organizing perspective. So to quickly go through a couple of examples for the promoting pedagogy and the community building. So in the promoting pedagogy, I really wanted to just leave a provocation here. Like one of the very common example you might come across is like, the image search result for the query CEO that shows basically a disproportionate number of white men. And sure, we can go, and obviously this is an exemplar of bigger issues and more subtle fairness and bias issues, and we should definitely be working on it. But I think we should also ask a question: what does it really fix in the real world if we made this page more representative? Would it make actually bigger impact in the real world to address these questions if we took that search result page and made it a site for actual emancipatory pedagogy? What if we invited like, feminist, queer, anti-racist scholars, activists, and artists to create an experience that teaches the history and of erasure, of people's erasure, of the movements and struggles against erasure? And what if like, what would that do for the world versus just making this page more diverse, right? So that's kind of the kind of ways of, I think we should think about these problems differently. In terms of community building, I wanted to say a few quick things. So obviously, one of the things I want to be very clear, this is not a call for IR researchers to be like, okay, I'm going to come in and save the world. This is not a call for techno-solutionism. This is a call for IR researchers to join in a collective struggle of solidarity with scholars from all of these other disciplines, with other legal policy experts, with civil rights, social justice activists. And in doing that, I think, especially for IR researchers, it's very important that we approach these spaces with curiosity and humility, and in recognition of our own incomplete understanding of the world, and be open to change and be changed by these encounters. And to do that, I think for people who want to work on emancipatory IR, we need to kind of start building the scaffolding to how to bring some of these community members over. Like, IR people who do want to do the right thing, but just do not have the right backgrounds and the expertise to jump into this kind of work. And then this next thing I want to talk about, there's obviously a lot of conversation happening in the world around DEI. And it is in the context of this kind of work that DEI is no longer just important for us from the perspective of being non-discriminatory. I think it becomes a very critical thing that needs to inform this kind of research. Because to challenge the homogeneity of the future imaginaries that is saliently bound by colonial, cis heteropatriarchal, and capitalist ways of thinking, we need broad and diverse participation from the community. And it's not just including people from different backgrounds, it is to also be inclusive of their politics and values. And this, in this context, I really love one of the quotes from a paper from by Oskis and others, co-authors, that goes, this must be about more than just bodies. It is not diversity if we only accept marginalized people who are stripped of the epistemic models that underpin the experiences of being other, or have the work they draw from those models held to an unequal standard of legitimacy. Some of the other things we might care about, especially in terms of community building and in that context, raising the socio-political consciousness, I think there are a lot of things we can, like, kind of lean on, like, for example, practices of territorial acknowledgement. Of course, territorial acknowledgement also can be problematic in a sense that it can just turn out to be a performatory exercise. So I think in that context, it really is important for us to not just do acknowledge on the land we stand on and the history of indigenous struggles, but to directly connect that with actionable critique of how we are ourselves complicit and our, technology, the community is complicit in some of these structures of oppression. So for example, in SIGAR 21, and again, I would today, if I were to write this, I would go much further. We did wanted to connect about, it's not just about that the conference is happening in Canada, which is the indigenous land of the Kanien'kehá:ka and Anishinaabe nations, but also to talk about how the text or the online spaces themselves intersects with conversations about indigenous sovereignty and rights, and also, and we didn't talk about it in that one, but things like how today there are conflicts about where we are putting in data centers and with indigenous lands and sovereignty, like all of those questions. I think this could be doing a technological or territorial acknowledgement in a IR conference could be a space where we could use that as a way to raise social political consciousness. We could also do specifically things like book clubs and reading groups, again, to read exactly things that are both giving us, it teaches us about the history of these struggles, but also intersects where they intersect with technology. And so that's some of my thoughts on the kind of practices and projects. And just to kind of the last bit of this framework is the provocation. So here I just want to shortly, very briefly say that this is where I'm thinking about how should different epistemologies or different history of different movements and struggles can inform this kind of emancipatory IR research, as well as some of the practices we should learn from our IR adjacent communities like HCI and social science, reflective practices that helps us explicate what our actual values are and helps us to have explicit conversation about that. So that's the overall, practices, projects, and provocations framework that I'm slowly starting to build on. And where are we today, right? Are these having any impact? So just to kind of give one example of this. So again, obviously, this is very early stage. I'm mostly trying to at least start these conversations and plant the seeds. That's how I think about doing this work. But I was trying to recently reflect on, what I've been trying to do and how I've been trying to do this over the last year. And a couple of examples that came to mind that made me feel good about is that, last year, we had the Computing Community Consortium workshop on the future of IR research in the age of generative AI. And in the report, they had a section on the social implications or ramifications. And I was part of the working group that worked on it. And it largely in the report really focuses on not on fairness, bias, or hallucination, but talking about the kind of structural things that we discussed in that book chapter. And it explicitly actually summarizes, cites that book chapter as kind of the framing device that they used in this report. Similarly, I was a few weeks ago, I was at the SWORL workshop, which is a workshop that happens in IR every 6 to 8 years, where they get together and think about what are going to be the important research directions and questions for the next 5 to 10 years. And again, it was coincidentally I put out the preprint of the Emancipatory IR just before this workshop, and it led to some conversations. And I was invited to give a seat talk, and it led to some conversation in the working group. And in fact, I think it would be safe to say it had not just that paper, but some of my other colleagues also who are thinking about the same kind of topics. We came together, and the workshop, one of the things that was really interesting is that the last time SWOL happened, which was in 2018, one of the key sections or direction they called out was FACT IR, fairness, accountability, confidentiality, and transparency in IR. Whereas this year we explicitly change that framing, and we said that it is important to change that framing to not just think about fairness and transparency and those aspects, but to actually think about how to center societal, democratic, and emancipatory values and ethics in IR. So the report is not out yet, but this is the title that we used for writing the report for our working group, and hopefully the report comes out in the next few weeks to a month or two. So with that, I will conclude. Sorry, I know I haven't left a lot of time for discussion. The last three things I just want to, on a concluding note, I want to mention is that I think at the end of the day, the things to kind of remember is emancipatory IR must challenge power, right? And we must ask question when we are doing this work, whose power we are challenging. I would almost cheekily say that if you're doing this kind of research and nobody's upset with you, you might want to go back and ask, am I really doing the correct critical work, or am I actually, is my work even potentially giving legitimacy to system that should not be made more fair or transparent, but should actually be dismantled? And if you're thinking about challenging power, obviously we then also have to be very thoughtful about how do we think about the sustainability, this kind of research, future funding, as well as protecting community members who are doing this kind of work from reprisal, from the power and visions of those who are trying to challenge. The second thing I've already talked about this is that emancipatory IR must be about movement building. And so we really need to think about any research we are doing, how vital it is movement building in that context. And if it is not, why not? And last but not the least, I think emancipatory IR must also prioritize praxis over proxies. Praxis here, I mean, like, all the research activities and reflections that are directed towards structural change. And by proxies, I'm referring to, like, proxy measures of success, like, is my model getting state of the art performance, or am I on the top of the leaderboard? And I would again reiterate that, like, this is not a call for techno solutionism or savior complex. We need to do this work not because IR needs to save the world, but because our liberation is very much bound up with the liberation of everybody else in the world, and we need to create the spaces where we come together and work. And so I promise this is the absolute final quote from this talk. I want to leave people on an optimistic note. And again, amazing author Arundhati Roy. Another world is not only possible, she is on her way. On a quiet day, I can hear her breathing. Thank you so much. These are the four papers that I mostly referenced in this particular talk. And so